Hello, everybody. And so we're going to get started. Give me one moment and I will put up my screen share. Okay, great. I hope you can see that. As this is the fourth class, I'm sure you know the routine right now at the beginning. It's a zenith or nadir. It's either the high point or the low point of David and Batsheva. David and Batsheva's imbroglio, and that imbroglio means an unwanted, difficult, and confusing situation full of troubles and problems. And today the topic is the conviction. So here we go. Before I start, I always like to thank you for allowing me this opportunity to share Torah learning with the congregation. Thank you, Rabbi Karapkin, and thank you, Elaine. Both of you are, whenever you have a lot of balls in the air, and I couldn't find a picture of balls in the air, so we picked umbrellas instead. But when a lot of things are going on, you always choose to focus only on the one ball or the one umbrella that is pertinent to the person you're talking with and take care of that problem. And I appreciate that, and I'm sure as everyone else does. I'd also like to thank the office staff. Avital and Shimon have been very helpful to me. And I'm sorry I didn't thank them before, but I'm sure there's more people behind the scenes that I don't know. But everybody has been great in this endeavor of learning about Batsheva and David. So thank you once again. A review quickly, because I'm sure if you don't have it already, you are welcome to go to the BYT website on YouTube. And now sessions 1, 2, and 3 are up there. So you're welcome to review that, or if you haven't seen them yet, you should do that before you continue here. The review is basically the question of David's culpability. Was he responsible? He was certainly responsible because he initiated the whole thing. But how responsible was he after that as the whole situation unfolded and got more complex? So we asked the question of, did she have a get al tanai, or get at all, or no get? And if she had a get al tanai, did he lidrosh? He went to figure that out. And was he responsible then for doing what he did? We want to say maybe that even if he was halachically okay, maybe he was morally not okay. And then when he figures that out, that it's a problem and she's pregnant, he brings Uriah in from the battle, tries twice to get him to go back to Batsheva, so that it shouldn't be an issue and the baby should be thought of as his. And then he refuses to do so, which is of course treasonous because it was a direct command from David. And so therefore we ask ourselves, is he therefore Uriah liable for treason? And therefore David is allowed to kill him in battle because he's treasonous. He's a mored b'malchut. And then we had last session, which is where Yoav and David's messages back and forth about this battle. Yoav accusing David under the radar so that the messenger wouldn't hear it, and David responding in kind with another message that the messenger wouldn't understand, but yet Yoav would. And also the very small implication is that despite the two big sins that David did or was professed to have done, which was obviously the initial adultery and killing of Uriah, there's also a secondary and a number of secondary sins, which include having Yoav be a partner in the killing of Uriah, and also the partners being all the other people around who died, the Jewish people in the army, and also causing the Ammonites to have to kill Uriah. So all of those things are secondary, and it's not the focus of today's class. But so we ended last week with this idea. And if you recall, before that, David had said to Uriah, he'd said, Al yera be'inecha et hadavar hazeh. He told him in one of his messages, don't feel that this is a bad thing, i.e. the bad thing that I have done and made you do. And maybe David bought his own advice, and maybe he didn't. Maybe he was feeling guilty, or maybe he truly felt like, okay, like this is what I had to do. You have to understand. And basically on the mashal about Asael that he gave to Uriah, to Yoav rather, maybe that was his message. Like I'm justified in what I did because I tried not to kill him, but I had to kill him, just like Avner had to kill Asael. Okay, so therefore we're asking ourselves that question, like, what did David feel? And maybe in the fifth class, if there is a fifth class, we will explore that concept. But for right now, we have the explicit statement V'yirah hadavar asher asa David be'enei Hashem, that God, in the eyes of God, it was displeasing to him what David had done. And that is an explicit statement in the text. And last week, Elaine L. brought in this idea, which I found a pasuk for, which I quite like. And I thought it was a good connection. The connection of in Mishle, it says, Bakol makom einei Hashem tzapot ra'im v'tovim. So in all places are the eyes of God. There's nowhere you can hide from God. He sees both good and bad. And I think that's a good message for us all, of course. So with that in mind, we're going to start reading our text. And as you're reading it, think about what's happening. But let's just understand the context of what's happening. In David, okay, let's read the first pasuk first, and then I'll explain the context. Vayishlach Hashem et Natan el David. So God sent, again, sending messengers. God sent Natan, the prophet, to David. V'yavo elav, and he came to him. Vayomer lo, and he said to him, Shnei anashim hayu ba'ir echad. There were two people in one city. Echad ashir ve'echad rash. One was wealthy and one was poor. So this is just like the case of Shlomo, remember, with the two women and whose baby it was, etc. One died, one didn't die, and Shlomo had to figure that out. That's the famous case. So kings would sit in judgment over cases that went beyond, like it's sort of like the Supreme Court of, after all the lower courts couldn't decide, the case would be brought to the king for his decision. And so ostensibly, David would believe that Natan was bringing him such a case. So in his eyes, this is what he's hearing, that there is two people, a wealthy person and a poor person. Okay, that seems like a legitimate case. So to the wealthy person, he had a lot of cattle and sheep, and harbe me'od, very, very many. And the poor person had not a lot. He only had one small lamb. Asher kana, that he had bought, v'chieha, and he caused her to live, v'tigdal imo, and she grew with him, v'im banav, and with his sons, yachdav, together. Mipito tochal, she ate from his bread, umikiso tishteh, and she drank from his cup, uv'cheko tishkav, v'ti lo levat. And she slept in his bosom, and she was to him as a daughter. Okay, so what could all this mean? Okay, we as the audience know where this is going. We know the parallels that Natan is trying to make, but David still thinks of it as a court case. So let's see what. It's called the Mashal Kivsat Harash, the parable of the lamb of the poor person. And there are three people so far in the parable: the wealthy person, the poor person, and the Kivsa. And most Mefarshim Chazal, they consider David to be the Ashir because, of course, he was very wealthy. But in this case, they're talking specifically, the Bakar and the Tzon are compared to his women. Okay, and the Rash had one wife, one woman, and he was considered poor in that sense. And obviously there's a power differential as well due to the wealth and the non-wealth of each of the men. And then the Kifsa, we would say it is Batsheva, and this is all in the conceptual realm. We all sort of understand the ideas based on the context. However, there's also a textual proof, if you want to say that, and the proof would be the highlighted word there. It says kivat, and it's a hint. It's not a absolute proof. It just sort of says, oh yeah, you're on the right track, people. So kivat would be kivat sheva. So this lamb was like a daughter, but we know that it wasn't really like a daughter. It was really like Batsheva. Okay. So I put in a chart because that's what I do. So we have the rich person is David, the poor person is Uriah, and the lamb is Batsheva. And then we go on. I'm pointing out here that he had, again, harbe me'od, he was very wealthy. The word kifsa, the text could have chosen that she would be some other animal. I don't know, a goat, a cow, whatever else it was. But they chose specifically the word kifsa, so keep that in mind. So now what happens is in the story, v'yavo helech. So a traveler comes, leish, to the leish hashir, to the wealthy man. V'yachmo lakachat mitzono u'mibkaro, and he was hesitant, where he had pity on his own sheep and cows. Lasot le'oreach, to make it, or to prepare it for food, for the oreach, habalo, that came to him. V'yikachat kivsat ha'ish harash. And so instead he took the little lamb of the poor neighbor. V'yaseha leish haba elav. And he made it up, he prepared it for the man that had come to him. Okay, so we're asking the question, who is this Helech that is coming to, who in the story could this Helech be? Well, we had an allusion to it last week, 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago. And let's see. Here's the hint. So this was from the first few psukim, and he was up on the roof, and he got up from his couch, and he was walking on the gag. So this traveler was up there with him on the gag. And again, it's an illusion. I'm not saying this is like the direct connection, but we're supposed to understand what was it that came to him on that gag. So we have from, I believe it was last week now, this idea. And remember the Tanhuma there was, Midrash Tanhuma was talking about the idea of Adam and man in general, mankind, and whether or not he has his Yetzer Hara makes him similar. Because he has a Yetzer Hara, he's not so similar to God, even though it says B'Tselem Elokim. That's where it starts, and then there's all these little discussions, and this is one of them. So here, remember, this was the idea that this is the story of Avimelech and a woman in the siege of Tevetz, where she threw a millstone onto the head of Avimelech, and Yoav sent this story as a comparison and saying, like the messenger would understand that this was the same scenario as how Uriah was killed because somebody threw an arrow from upon the wall of the fortress and killed Uriah. So that would be the plain meaning. But of course, the deeper understanding based on the context of Yetzer Hara is Yoav was saying to David, wait a second, you, the Gibor, right? It's a Gibor at the top here, right? You, the Gibor, was vanquished by a woman through the fact that your Yetzer Hara, you were weak in your Yetzer Hara. Okay, so that's the background. We did that, I believe, last week, but there's more to it. We have also this idea from Pirkei Avot, right? Ben Zoma Omer, and Ben Zoma said, Ezehu Gibor, I'm sure this is quite familiar to you, who is, again, a Gibor, a mighty person, HaKovesh et Yitzro. Isn't that interesting? Kovesh, Kivsa. I'm not going to say that it's a direct connection, and I'm not going to say that Pirkei Avot was written with Batsheva and David in mind, but it's just interesting, right? So who is a Gibor? Someone who is able to conquer his inclination, right? Shenemar in Mishlei, as it says in Mishlei, Tov erech hapayim mi Gibor, umoshel berucho milkod ir. I'm going to read it in English. He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that rules his spirit than he that takes a city. So again, the imagery of the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, over the idea of the strength of a Gibor. And finally, I just think it's interesting as well. It says, Ezehu Ashir. Think of our Ashir in our story, Hasamech Bechelko, that he is happy with his lot. So indeed, the lot that David had was all of these women, all in the parable, all of the sheep, but really all of the women. He had everything he could possibly want, but yet he was not satisfied. Okay. So now we have added to our little story that David is the rich, or he is the poor person, Batsheva is the lamb, and the visitor is the Yetzer Hara. Okay, and what's interesting though about the Yetzer Hara in the story is it has different names. Let's go back. So in the beginning, Beyavo Helech, he was just a traveler. The Yetzer Hara was this traveler, and then David didn't want to take from his own stock of sheep, right? Lasot le'oreach habalo. He didn't want to do that for the guest. Now it's a guest. It's moved from a traveler who was standing outside your door, where you haven't let him in, where you still have that choice, to he's moved inside your house now. And now you have to prepare things for him. You have to make sure he's happy. Okay, and then finally, he turns into v'yaseh la'ish. He becomes a man. Ish in Tanakh is generally thought of as someone of importance. So therefore, this guest, which you could refuse to have in your house, is now someone in your house and is now an important person that you want to run to do everything possible to keep it happy. Very good parable. And just to show that there is such a parable, here it is from Sukkah. So here it basically says it in English. Rava said this. Initially, a verse called the evil inclination a traveler coming from afar. Subsequently, the verse calls it a guest as one welcomes it. Ultimately, the verse calls it a man, indicating significance as it became the homeowner. as it is stated the parable of the poor man's lamb, that Nathan the prophet said to David, and there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was reluctant to take of his own flock and of his own herd to prepare the guest. And it is written in the same verse, and he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man that was come to him. In other words, the evil inclination that began as a traveler gradually gained prominence. Okay, so I said it twice now, but the picture's nicer than when I said it the first time. Next. So if we look again, what are we seeing here? We're seeing that the story takes place, and we're wondering, is that it? Is there any problem with our story so far? So if you want to pause and take a moment to think about that, but I'll give you a hint. The hint is that Batsheva, as the lamb, what end does she meet? Well, in the story, she meets the end as, right? She's gone, she's dead. And that's not the right story, right? Because in the end, what happens? It's Uriah who's dead. So we're going to go back and look at the whole story a second time. And I'm going to give you the idea of Rabbi Yoshua Berman, who's also a professor at Bar Ilan. He was my professor, and he came also to visit BOIT a number of years ago. Very, very prominent person in today's Torah learning community, today's in Israel. And all over the world, because he's written a number of books that are great, and I highly recommend them if you can get your hands on them. So anyway, so he basically says that David is still the rich person, but because of our problem with the killing of Uriah, then Uriah must be the lamb. And if Uriah is the lamb, then Batsheva would be the poor person. And that kind of makes sense because, they were still a couple, right? The poor person and the lamb still live together, so that kind of works. But again, we're going to go back to the idea of conceptual versus textual. So conceptually, we have Uriah as the lamb. That kind of makes sense because he was killed in the story. But do we have a textual support for that? So before we get onto Batsheva. So the support for that comes here. We have the idea in this parable, right? So the poor person had nothing, but yet he had this little lamb, and then it says those three things that he ate. I'm sorry I didn't bring the English, but as we go, right? That she ate from his bread, and she drank from his cup, and she lay in his bosom. So the question is, have we heard these three things in order in this sequence together before? And Rabbi Berman suggests that this doesn't occur anywhere else in Tanakh, except for just prior, if we remember, in the story of David and Uriah's discussion, Uriah says this. He says that like everybody is down in the fields, they're sleeping in Sukkot, and they're lying in the fields. And I will go to my house, le'echol, to eat, ulishtot, and to drink, ulishkavi mishti, and to lay with my wife. So it's just very interesting that in these words, Uriah is basically saying, I am the lamb. And again, we're going to know that means the lamb to slaughter. So, okay, so that is our textual proof there. But now we're going to go back and just hold this slide for a moment while we talk about Batsheva. How can Batsheva be the poor person? Well, if you look again, David is the wealthy person. He has the power. She has no power in the situation because they really are the primary two people within the story, correct? So she is the person who things were done to, who has no power no agency to take hold of her own situation. And so that's by definition rich and poor, and even in our society we see that. But more than that, let's go through her story just for a moment to understand more completely. She starts out by being taken, and we can say forcefully or not, we have the whole idea that maybe she had a plan to get herself taken, but let's just not put that aside for now, since most Meforshim don't go with that plan. So don't go with that idea. So Batsheva was innocently taken, and not only just taken physically moved, but also taken sexually and possibly raped, or possibly not so raped. We went over that in the first session. But sorry. And after that, she goes home, right? So at that point, she's like feeling used. I can't understand how a woman endures such degradation. And then after that's over, she waits and she sees that she's pregnant. And oy vavoila, she's like also devastated. She doesn't know what she's going to do. She's in crisis. And so she says, okay, if I tell David, he might kill me just to get rid of the problem. So I have to take that risk, and I'm going to send him a note. But then she says, okay, but maybe the people of the town will stone me because they'll know that I'm an adulteress. So that's also a problem. So she's very, very, very upset within herself. So then she waits and she waits, and she doesn't hear back from David, and the baby's growing. And she says she might have heard that Uriah came, but she might not know that Uriah came back from the battlefield. And if she doesn't know, she's just waiting there for maybe a couple months, maybe at least a couple weeks, and she doesn't have any idea what's happening. And then all of a sudden she hears that Uriah died. Now and then there goes all of her hope, because at least if Uriah would have come back, we have the idea that she could have explained something to him. The baby would have a father. She wouldn't be all alone, etc. So that's why when we had this slide, we talked about, like, it's just odd that it sounds like, well, let's just read it again. V'tishma eshet Uriah, so she heard, the wife of Uriah heard, ki met Uriah, that he had died, Isha, her husband, v'tispot al ba'ala, and she mourned for her husband. So it's a very, very connection of husband and wife there. And we were wondering, like, did she really love him? Is that the issue? And maybe she did. But now we can put it in a different context and say, not only maybe she did love him, but more than that, he was her last hope. She hadn't heard from David. She didn't know what was going on. She thought David had abandoned her, but at least possibly her husband would be there for her and the baby. But now that he's dead, it's even a bigger situation of crisis. Okay, so in that sense, we can say she is the poor person. But Rabbi Berman says not only is she the poor person overall, that David would have looked at her as not only the Rash, but also as the visitor. And how so? And I've given you there the link to Rabbi Berman's Shiur in Hebrew. And I'm sorry, it's not a hyperlink. You're going to have to type it in, or you just look up in Hebrew Rabbi Berman, Kivsat Harash, Mashal Kivsat Harash, and you'll find it. Very well worth listening to, and he's a dynamic speaker, and it was really good. Okay, so let me explain how he thinks she's the visitor, because from the moment that she sent him the message that she was pregnant, therefore, what is a visitor? What is a traveler? It's someone who is not totally in control. It's someone who has needs that can't be met by himself, but must be helped by other people. So similarly, Batsheva was the traveler in that she had to fix this situation. She was needy for some resolution to the problem. And therefore, David stepped in, and by stepping in, he had good intentions. Just like in the mashal, the person who wanted to be hachnasat orchim, to invite guests into his house, had a really good, really nice halachic idea to have people come and partake of his feast. However, he went about it in the wrong way. So similarly, the idea at that moment when David said, okay, I have to do something here, I have to help her. And now obviously the best thing would have been had he stepped up and said, okay, I'm the husband, I got to deal with this. But he had hoped to resolve it in a different way, which, we can also judge or think about whether that was the right way or not. But nevertheless, he went about the fixing of the problem in not the correct way, just as the Ashir went about the fixing of the problem in the wrong way in the mashal. Okay, so let's just, so that was the conceptual idea of why Batsheva was both the traveler and the Rash. So now we're going to bring the textual proof, or the textual support. So it says, in our mashal, it says, V'yavo helech le'ish, so that the traveler came to the wealthy man. And that makes sense. You need the v'yavo there. But then there's two more v'yavos, or haba, right, the same verb root, that we don't really need in the context of the sentence, right? And again, I'm sorry I didn't bring the English. It's just too complicated, and often the English isn't translated correctly, okay? So he did not want to use his own things, right? La'asot le'oreach haba lo. And you could just say la'asot le'oreach, to make the food preparations for the guest. He didn't say haba lo. Well, we understand that, of course, the oreach is coming to him, right? So that was unnecessary. So it's emphasizing haba lo, and we're asking why. And again, the final one, right? V'yaseha, so eventually he did make the kifsa of the Rush for the traveler, And Laish haba elav. Again, we knew who it would be. We knew who he was making it for, right? The Helech, the Oreach, and the Ish, same person, who haba elav. We didn't need that extra information. It's the same information 3 times. And so therefore we have to ask ourselves, have we heard this before? And what's the connection? So again, going back to the first few psukim of the story, we see this. Remember, he sent messengers and he took Batsheva at the very beginning. And remember, we talked in the context of the approach, the introduction to sexual relations. You often have the terminology of vayavo eleha, that the man approached her, the man was the initiator of the whole event, right? But in this case, it's anomalous because it says v'tavo elav, and we had reasons why that might be. But nevertheless, the concept of haba elav and v'tavo elav could make the connection between this idea that Batsheva was indeed this traveler. Okay, so now, if we look at it, we have the Chazal, the sages, with the initial that Batsheva was the kivsa. And then we have Rabbi Berman's idea that Uriah was the kivsa because he was the actual one killed. Batsheva was never killed. And if you look at it, in this scenario, Batsheva was taken, and it was the mashal about adultery, right? If she was the kivsa, if she was taken for the needs of David, then it was due to adultery. But if Uriah was taken, then Uriah was killed, then the sin that happened was not adultery, but was murder. So you can read it 2 different ways. Okay. So let's now go to David's response to that. But before that, remember that David did not understand this to be a mashal. He understood this to be a court case. So he was asked to be judging the court case. And this is what he says. He was very, very upset with the man, the ish, being the ish Shiur, the wealthy man. Vayomer el Natan, and he said to Natan, Chai Hashem kiven mavet ha'ish ha'oseh zot. This person who has done this is worthy of death. Okay, v'hakivsa yishalem arba'atayim, and the lamb he must pay for 4 times over. Ekev asher asa et hadavar hazeh, because he did this thing. Ve'al asher lo chamal, and because he did not have pity. Okay, so we can ask ourselves a few things, but we are not going to focus on this in this class. I'm going to save it for the 5th class if we have such a class. And but we're going to ask ourselves a few questions, just as a nikuda for what's upcoming. The question of, why is it such a big punishment, right? Why does he deserve death? That's a question you could be thinking about. And arba time we can talk about, but it's not so important, but that would be the correct payment for something that was stolen that was then killed. Okay. Okay, so at that point, David's thinking, okay, I've given my sak, this is good, we're done. And then what happens? No, before we get to there. Before we get to there, I'm going to give you the next series of psukim, but I know there's no English here, but stop for a moment and ask yourself, what do you notice within the psukim of these words, within the verses here? And again, pause it if you want to think about it for a second, but if we move on, you'll see that these items are there. And this samech, and sometimes it's a pei, and sometimes it's a samech, and if it's in English, it's either going to be an S or a P. And we women don't often get to see the Torah scroll itself, but in the Torah scroll, this is symbolic of spacing in the Torah, and it looks like this. We have 2 options. We have a stuma, which would be that there's words here, and then there's a blank space there. And then a ptucha is when it comes and then there's no words, it comes at the end of the line, basically, that blank space. And both of these function somewhat like in English, we have paragraph functions. So it's either to offset, to highlight, to emphasize, or just to say that this content within these 2 breaks, that is a unitary concept. Okay, so I think that's just an interesting point that we all, we can notice that now as we read through different svarim, not svarim, but the different chumashim. Okay, so now if we look at them more closely, we see this. We see that this one here and this one here, and then the 2 at the bottom, offset a very short pasuk. Okay, so obviously as the reader's reading, as you're looking at it visually, it gives it importance. Okay, so don't read what it says yet if you know Hebrew, but that will be, this is the sort of the first, and then this is the response. But also, if you notice this, Ko Amar Hashem introduces a section, and then the section ends, and then Ko Amar Hashem introduces the next section. So I'm going to suggest, actually Rabbi Berman is going to suggest that Ko Amar Hashem occurs as a sort of a note for us, a ringing of a bell, for a Pavlov's bell for us to know that when the Navi has given a chazon or a nevuah, or in this case a mashal, so when he's given a prophecy or some kind of vision or some kind of parable, the idea here is now the Navi is saying with these three words, I'm going to explain to you what I meant. Okay, so let's see what happens next. So remember, the David has told us, this is my psak. Okay, the person has to die and pay 4 times. And he's thinking, obviously, just as a side note, again, we'll hopefully get to it next class, David is not thinking about himself at all, because if he did, he certainly wouldn't have decreed that he would be worthy of death, right? So this can't be on his mind. It can't be something that he's aware of at this moment. And you can ask the question, well, why didn't he see himself in the parable? That's another question. So, but because of that, we know he didn't. And then Natan says to him, "Vayomer Natan el David, Ata ha'ish, you are the man. You are the man that did this awful thing." Okay? And obviously that's dramatic, and it's set off by the 2 stumot. Okay, and then we get into the first Ko Amar. Now, if I would ask you to read the Ko Amar, which I would love to do, and you can pause and think of this. There's 2 sections, and the first 2 psukim, the first 2 verses are 1 section, and the second 2 psukim are the next section. Today, we're not going to focus so much on the first 2 psukim. We're going to read them through just so you hear them, but you can ask yourself sort of why they're there. What's this all about? And again, maybe in the 5th class, we will answer that. But the last 2 psukim, as we get to it, I'm going to ask you this question. As we read it, what do you think is the primary sin that is being discussed here, the primary one? Okay, so let's read. Oopsie, there you go. Ko Amar Hashem Elokei Israel. So says God, the God of Israel. Anochi meshachticha lemelech al Israel. I anointed you the king over Israel. Ve'anochi hitzalticha miyad Shaul. And I saved you from the hand of Shaul. Ve'etna lecha et beit adonecha. I gave you the house of your master. Ve'et neshei adonecha, and the wives of your master bechekecha, in your bosom. Ve'etna lecha et Beit Israel veYehuda, and I gave you the house of Israel, i.e. both kingdoms, north and south. Ve'im me'at ve'osifa lecha kehena vechahena. And if that wasn't enough for you, I would have given you more. So then, okay, so the question is, how does that fit? We're going to leave that for today. Madua bazita et devar Hashem. Why did you, and here it says flouted, but I prefer the words like disgraced or shamed God. Right? La sot hara be'enai, to do the evil in my eyes. Et Uriah Hachiti hikita b'cherev. Uriah the Hittite you killed with a sword. Ve'et ishto lakachta lecha, and you took for yourself his wife, leisha, as a wife for yourself. Ve'oto haragta b'cherev b'nei Ammon, and him you killed with a sword. The b'nei Ammon actually killed them. Ve'ata lo tasur cherev mebitecha, so therefore the sword will not leave your house ad olam, forever. Ekev ki bizitani, because you shamed me or you disgraced me. Ve'tikach et eshet Uriah, and you took the wife of Uriah Hachiti, liot lecha leisha, to be your wife. Okay, so if you want to pause beforehand and think what the primary sin would be here, and then now this is what it is. This is what I believe it is. And the idea, and it says twice, that he killed Uriah with the sword. Now, you might say, maybe that's not true, because there's also this idea, you took her for your wife. But again, if you read carefully, and I'm not going to read it here for you carefully, but you can take a moment and do that, you'll see that the implication is certainly, because you took her for a wife, that would imply not the original sin of taking her for the purposes of adultery, but you took her after you had killed Uriah to be your wife. And again, I might have mentioned it before, but the idea is when he took her at that point, if people did not know that he had killed Uriah, people in the streets would be going, wow, what a great king. He took this poor woman who has nothing now because her husband was killed in war, and he was a great general of her husband. So therefore, wow, what a great king. So Dafka that. But again, note that it would be afterwards. So I think here the emphasis is on the killing of Uriah. And as a support for that, because the punishment fits the crime, and it says, so now the sword is not going to leave your house. So if your crime is using a sword, then the punishment is the sword's not going to leave your house. Okay. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, the second koamar. Remember we said koamar. The koamar means, I'm going to explain it now, but now there's two koamar, so therefore there must be two explanations. So koamar Hashem, hineni mikima lecha ra'a. I'm going to cause for you to be bad, mebeitecha, from within your own house. Velakachta et nashecha, I'm going to take your wives, le'einecha, in front of your eyes. Venatati lere'echa, and I'm going to give them to your fellow, and in this case it's going to be his son. V'shechav im nashecha, and he's going to sleep with your wives, le'einei hashemesh hazot, in front of this sun. Right? Ki ata asita baseter, because you did it in hiding. Ve'ani aseh et hadavar hazeh neged kol Yisrael v'neged hashemesh. I'm going to do this in front of not only the sun, but in front of all of Israel. So obviously the crime being talked about here, the sin, is not anything to do with cherev. It is about the idea that he took beseter, which would be obviously the only time he took her. Beseter was the first time. He took her publicly as his wife the second time. So it must be referring to the behavior of the first few psukim. Okay, so now having that, we have to say to ourselves, we have to look again just for a second. We have to, right, this is where he accused Ataha Ish. And then we have the first Koamar, and we notice that that's Becherev with a sword. So therefore it's referring to the death or the murder of Uriah. And then we have the second Koamar, which the main word is Vashechav. And so therefore it's referring to the adultery. And then we're going to have the final orange portion, which talks, I believe this is my next slide. Nope, it isn't. So before we get to that, then we have we had this slide before, right? The green part rather is the idea of adultery, and this is of murder. So Rabbi Berman now says, wait a second, I'm not claiming that this is the sole understanding. I'm actually claiming that both understandings, this understanding that I've put forth to you and Chazal's understanding, it is purposefully meant to be slightly obscure so that you can understand them in both ways. Why do you need to understand them in both ways? Because there were two koamars, because there's one explanation and then a second explanation. And each explanation corresponds to the adultery of the murder. So therefore, it is more complete if you understand it both ways. And I personally agree with him. I think that's a brilliant insight. And if you again, it's coming from looking at the text and the wording of the text and how the text is structured. And I think that God embedded that idea within the text so that we should derive it, so that we should grapple with it, and so that it becomes ours when we do that. And I think that that's really important. Okay. So we've done the middle parts of the two koamars, and then we're getting now to the second orange part. So we notice the parallel between Vayomer Natan el David and Vayomer David el Natan. So it's a back and forth conversation, and David then responds to Natan saying, Vayomer David el Natan, Chatati LaShem, I have sinned to God. And in sinning to God, we ask ourselves, like we want to say, what is sinning to God? I mean, I've killed a man and I've taken a woman. So how does that jibe with each other? And some people bring that as a problem, but we can maybe deal with that in the next part, because that's not what we're here for today. But it's just something to think about in the meantime. If you want to come up with some ideas, I'd be happy to hear them. You're welcome to send me an email, or we can talk about them next time. Okay, but the idea here is this is two words, right? Chatati LaShem. And many of the Mefarshim, and Rav Meidan I'm going to bring up next week, he does a whole discussion between someone else who sinned towards God and what his response was. That would be Shaul, and he makes excuses, etc., whereas David right away says, no, I've done something bad, I've sinned. Okay. Recalling also that previously in the Tanakh, somebody else gave two words, and you can go back and look at my other series on Yehuda and Tamar to see that he answered when he was confronted with the problem that he was facing, with the sin that he had done. And he said also two words, right? He said, Tzadka mimeni, and she's more righteous than I am. She's correct and I am not. And so therefore also a person who immediately understood what, as soon as it clicked, he did not make excuses. He said, yes, that's correct. I am wrong. And I think that that is, and Yehuda, and sorry, before I get there, both Yehuda and David are the precursors of Mashiach, right? And so therefore we can say that this is a quality that is very highly prized in Judaism, to be able to understand yourself and understand that if you've done something wrong, you must own up to it. And again, David took some time to own up to it, and I'm not saying he's perfect, and Chazal doesn't say he's perfect. Well, some people do, but most people, no, I wouldn't say most, maybe a large number of people will admit that he did things that are wrong. But nevertheless, the idea is to own up to your sin is a very great male. It's very, very, very noteworthy, very worthy, a worthy trait, a worthy character trait. Okay, and to note that further, just with these two words, it's a very small amount of words and not really well explained how contrite he was about what he had done. So therefore, we'd have to go to Tehillim, Perek Nun Aleph, Perek 51, and we see this. It starts off, right? Bevo elav Natan HaNavi. So this is a psalm of David. Bevo elav Natan HaNavi. When Natan the prophet came to David, Kasher ba el Batsheva, when he had in the issue with Batsheva, and then the whole discussion there of how upset he was, how sad he was, how contrite he was. But I just want to point out the orange section where it says Lecha levadcha chatati, and that's a reiteration of what we just heard, right? I have sinned to you, God. V'hara be'einecha asiti, and what is bad in your eyes I have done. Again, a reiteration of what we've already heard. So that's just interesting, and I suggest that you take Tehillim Nun Aleph and explore it for yourself. It's a lot of very beautiful wording, right? And I brought the graphic because this is Lev Tahor over here, Lev Tahor Bara Li Elokim, beautiful song as well, right? And he's saying, like, he's you can read in his words that he's very, very upset with what he's done. And I just wanted to also point out that I brought this pasuk here, Adonai Tzvatai Tivtach Ufi Yagiti Latecha. This is the opening that we say before we say Shmon Esrei. So I just want to note for you that this is where it comes from. Okay, and so with that, we're going to go back, as we always do, to find out what we're talking about. So the title is The Conviction, and obviously there's two things that were the conviction here. The first conviction was the conviction of Natan, of David, of the crime that he had done, or the crimes in this case. And then the second way to understand the conviction is the conviction of David in giving his answer that I have sinned. And I think that those both hold weight with the answer. And so finally, before we sign off, I am giving you my email, and as always, I would love to have any feedback, any questions, and if we do have a session next week, I'm not sure whether it will be at the regular time or we will schedule something different, because I'd like to follow up with this and finish up, because there are some threads that are still straggling. Okay, nevertheless, thank you all for coming, and I appreciate your interest in the Batsheva and David story, which I think is fascinating. So, and again, I would love to have your feedback in any way, shape, or form. Questions, comments, etc. And thank you again. Bye-bye.